More Than Rich podcast. Today I'm here with Joseph Santana.
Hi, how are you, Joseph? It's interesting, a Joseph and a Joseph.
I know, I was like, is it making it a little more intimidating? Right.
Well, you go by Joe Cat. I usually go by Joe, so we're cool. If you want to just call me Joe,
that works. Still talking to myself, but that works. So today on our podcast, we're thrilled to welcome Joseph Santana, Chairman and CDO of Power Circle. Is that currently or was that previous?
No, that's currently what I do.
Okay. And visionary leader in the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion with a rich background in corporate leadership and passionate commitment to creative and inclusive workplaces. You've been at the forefront of transformative DEI initiatives. I know your innovative approach, it definitely combines strategic business insights with a deep understanding of the human elements that drive organizational change, literally. So like as an advocate for leveraging technology and AI to enhance DEI efforts, Joseph's work is shaping the future of corporate culture. So join us on this journey, exploration of AI and DEI, because I definitely want to dive into how you see that coming into play in the workplace in our interview. And maybe we can uncover some philosophies and stuff beyond all that. Where are you currently at? You said New York City.
I am. I'm in New York City. I actually live on the island of St. Kitts for about 2 months of the year during the winter months. And, St. Kitts is like 80 degrees or something along that line. Usually every day, if you look at the weather, it says 80 degrees at the height, it's going to be like 80, 81 degrees. And at nighttime, it's going to be somewhere like maybe 79 degrees or whatever. I don't think anybody ever actually measures the weather. They just take it for granted that every day is a duplicate of the previous day, right?
That's a good point.
But here it is cold for me now because I haven't gotten used to it yet. Even though now it's starting to come up to maybe the high 50s, low 60s. I think it's just me. My blood has to rethicken itself.
Does the weather actually affect your mood? Do you notice?
I think that it's interesting enough because I do this every year. I've been doing this for almost a decade now. When I leave New York and I go to St. Kitts and it is cold here but warm over there, it takes me a while to kind of get used to the extra heat and to feel comfortable moving around. So maybe a little less peppy than I normally am. Then when I come back here, it's the opposite. And the same thing happens. The cold makes me feel like maybe I should be sleeping instead of, it always takes me like a week or two before I make that transition and get used to the new weather.
Sounds like you're coming off a drug almost.
It feels that way. It does. It sometimes feels that way. It's like I go from an area where there might be like 2 or 3 cars when I'm driving on a peninsula to an area where there might be like, 15 cars ahead of me and 10 behind me. Yeah. So again, it just feels like a shift in the way that that I have to operate and so forth. The temperature's different, everything is different, but it's worth it. It certainly is worth it.
Yeah. Does that really make you view the world any differently? Just going from the isolation back and elaborate on that.
It does because when you live inside a particular country or even a state within a country, you don't realize how much of your perception of the world around you is shaped just by the things that you see every day, the people, how they interact with each other, their demeanor. They're rushing or are they a little more chilled and so forth. When you go to another country or even another state and you go in the beginning, sometimes you might notice that everybody else is maybe a little more calm, a little more chill than you are, or the opposite. And then after a while, you begin to fit into that. You begin to either slow yourself up or speed yourself up, and then it becomes invisible to you. So when you constantly leave one environment and you go to another environment, it heightens your sense of how much your environment affects you.
That's interesting. You made me think that there's different ways to blend in and get accustomed.
Yeah. There are different, and when you go, let's say for example, if I was in St. Kitts and I went to a restaurant, I might be sitting there for 45 minutes before someone brings me a drink. They're not being rude. They just have a different pace, right?
Wow.
So when I first go there from New York, it feels like, wow, usually I'm paying the bill around this time. But when I come back to New York City, like the other day, my wife and I went to this restaurant just to have breakfast, and it felt like everything was coming at us really fast. And then we realized, no, they're doing what they normally do. It's us, right?
Yeah.
And we don't realize how much we acclimate to the different places where we are. And, if you can take that into organizations also, people work in
Wow.
companies and they become acclimated to the behavior
We
in that
expect
company.
everything fast. You made me think that immediately.
We do. And depending on where we are, we may be on the high side. So let's say this is a band between the high side and the low side of a particular activity, hyper or kind of lethargic, right? And in one setting, we become more, we might be on the more hyper side, depending on our personality within that setting. But then we might be on the more hyper side of another setting, which is actually lethargic for where we were before. There was an interesting thing that I read a long time ago, totally off topic, but I think makes that point, where they talked about an experiment that was done in a gymnasium. And what they did was they very quietly increased the number of resistance weights and so forth that they had in the gym. And what they found was that people that were lifting, let's say at 80% of what was totally available, gradually increased what they were doing until they were doing 80% of what was totally available in this new setting. So everybody reset themselves to that new setting. And I think the advice in the article was that people that wanted to really, bulk out their physique and build up should probably work out with people that are bigger than they are, or people that are more advanced, because what happens is that raises your game, because we all have like this little thermostat, I guess, inside of us that says you're at the 80% mark, and the 80% mark here is between here and here. 80% mark over here is between here and here. 80% mark here is between there and there. So settings do make a difference. Environments do make a difference in terms of how people behave, perform, and feel about the things around them.
I feel like that also translates to how we talk to children too, like where you talk to them ahead of what they can understand,
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk to kids, I mean, in many cases, they're looking at it from a particular, set point of their own experiences. And we may be, it's interesting because of the way communications work. You could be talking to someone who has a totally different experience, and they're taking your words that you're forming and that you are saying to them are basically capturing imagery that's in your mind and things that you're thinking about, that particular situations that you've been in, feelings that you've had. And so that's what you're basically taking and crunching down into words. And then you're saying it to another person who picks up those words and then references the imagery they have in their mind, which may be quite different than yours, right?
Yeah.
So their perception of what you're saying is also shaped by their experiences. So when you have a child, you have a big age differential. The perception of that child is totally different from the perception of somebody who's older.
You also make me kind of wonder, like when we're talking about expectations and, wanting things fast, of how much is that is actually cultural and how much is it just people wanting to because they can exercise their free will, like because I can. Like, what is it? Is it really more environmental?
I think it's a mix. I think some of us are a little more driven to want to do things faster and better. But also faster and better are relative terms, and it depends on where we are. It's always faster and better than whom, right?
Yeah.
So if you are,
we're always comparing it, right?
Yeah. If you're playing in one particular field, faster and better could be, at a certain level that may not be faster and better in another field. And I think, people in sports especially experience that as they go from, learners to minor league to major leagues, the same things that they were doing with the same amount of energy are different when they're in different settings. And again, that organizationally, that's the same thing. When you move, if you've ever moved from one company to another, what might have been considered really great performance in one environment may not in another environment for a number of reasons, different philosophy, different settings, different expectations.
That definitely is a good transition, because I was going to try to get in, how do we talk about the DEI experience? So let's go into your early life a little bit and tell me what that was like and your interest. And I'm sure big proponent for International Women's Day just passed.
Yeah. So, it's really interesting. I mean, I come from a pretty, eclectic background. I mean, my family, my aunts and so forth, married into different groups, and, we've got, everything in the, under the spectrum, under the sun. And of course, my own children later on married into different groups. But as I was growing up, I mean, I think that, like everybody else, I'm a product of my environment, and that's, kind of all I knew. Until I started getting older and I started working and I started being among a lot of other people. And I think for most people, that's their first experience when they step out of their cocoon, and because you're used to relating to family, friends a certain way, and you live in a particular environment. Then you go into the workplace and people are coming from different cocoons, and they're coming from different ways of looking at the world, different ways of measuring, different ways of driving their own behavior. And, I very early on in my work career, so right before I got into the field that I ended up in later on, I did a lot of work that was more along the lines of accounting, and later on IT management and stuff like that. So I ran, operations and groups and so forth.
Can we go backwards a little bit? Because I still want to understand just how you were molded. Like, did you work any jobs maybe that you didn't like, maybe as a kid, as a teen, before you got into trying to understand just how your personality shaped
interesting.
your interests?
Yeah, interesting enough. I mean, I've done a variety of different things since I was, since I was a teenager. I did different types of work, but, I think that very early on, my interest was always along the lines of, what makes people do what they do, or what makes people see things the way
Human
they see
behavior,
them.
or more so
It was kind of more the
psychology?
human behavior side. And I think the human behavior side was because my own family and the people around me came from such varieties of backgrounds that it was like sometimes like I realized, like, is that good or bad? Just
Couldn't understand him at a certain point.
yeah. Is the way they judge things as good or bad? Is that like a universal truth, or is that essentially something that they see because of their own perspective and where they're looking at the world? The way they look at the world.
That's rare. You're forming your own opinions, is what you're telling me.
Yeah. So in a very early age, I kind of noticed that different people they were referencing different things when they made up their minds about different things. And
you were questioning it.
I was questioning it. Yeah. And then later on, when I went to school and so forth, and later on when I went to college, I studied accounting, and I liked numbers. I thought numbers were interesting. I just didn't like closing books and opening books for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that some things are fascinating to learn, and kudos to everybody out there who does this work. No blackballing here, but
that's
kudos
true
to everybody who does the work. But not everybody's cut out to do the work that's repetitive like that.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not, right? So very early on, I began to realize that the areas where I excelled, the areas where I had my biggest interests, were primarily in exploring how people work together and how they relate to each other. And, I think in another life, if I had made another career choice, I probably would have been a psychologist.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so closely related, what you're talking about.
Yeah. And so, in the beginning, when I first, when I because I did so many different jobs in terms of accounting, and then, I did I worked as a developing programs for organizations. After a while, I got into that essentially because accounting was being automated. And I started working with a lot of the people that were doing the automation and helping them by providing input into, well, we take this number and we get it here, and this is how we get a picture of this. And while I was doing that, I thought, like, this is more interesting than what I was doing before. I think I'd rather do this, right?
You're already early AI, by the way.
right. So I started getting into this, right? And then later on, as time went by and I started working more with people, I realized that, what makes people tick, what makes people perform, what makes people do well or poorly has a lot to do with a lot of different elements of how they experience the world, what pre-beliefs they come with, what,
Are we getting into like Myers-Briggs right now?
Yeah, but it's even more than that, because I think human beings are very complex.
Yeah.
And I think that all those tests measure different things about us, but none of them provides a complete picture
Absolutely.
of what we are.
I do get kind of bummed that some people take it as you're putting them in a box, because I don't feel like that at all. I just want to understand someone better, even if it is a generalization, and I know it doesn't put them in a box. But a lot of people do interpret and take it like that, so they don't care to study it more.
Exactly. And the thing is, models like Myers-Briggs or any other model like that, the benefit that they have is that they allow you to look at things through a certain filter so that certain things will stand out.
Yeah.
And you can say, oh, I got that, right? But it doesn't give you like a universal look at this entire object that exists in our physical world. It gives you only this look that comes from de-emphasizing some things and emphasizing others. Then you have other tools that'll help you, to emphasize other things. And even some of the categorizations that we use, for people when we're talking about inclusion or diversity and stuff like that, a person who is a person who, let's say, for example, is a male who is born in the United States, who is of Hispanic descent, is not exactly the same as someone who was born in another country, who came here as a child, who is a female, so it's like these categories that we create only allow us to see cross sections of the whole person. But if you really want to understand a person, you have to see where they are at the intersection of all these things. So I'm a big believer in using multiple models to assess things like, where are they perceptually? Where are they in terms of, how they see themselves culturally? It's all these different tools that you need in order to get a better picture, as opposed to just taking one mold and saying, this is where Joe belongs. This is where Frank belongs. This is where those molds usually are not very effective in capturing the total essence of who and what we are.
What are the typical challenges if we consider how everything's just kind of been automated and made easier for your end of the, like all this stuff that you do, maybe HR, for example, a lot more easier. You just sift through things, but how is that challenging or making your jobs any more difficult?
Well, here's the thing, right? It's becoming the ability to do things, to get work done, is speeding up, right? So if I had to go through 600 resumes, I would have to lock myself up for a couple of days, with a lot of caffeine, and I'd have to sit there reading every single one. A computer can do that a lot faster, right? It can sort through them at a much greater speed. However, the elements of what it's looking for and what it thinks is the right person or the right fit for a particular job is predetermined by someone. Either A, because they programmed it that way, or B, if they created a system that's a little more intelligent or based more on AI, they still had to train it with something. So depending on the data that they gave it, and they said, here, train on this, it's going to have a certain bent. So I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by that.
Sounds like you're getting into bias, but we can We can get into
Yes,
that. Yeah.
but I'm getting into bias as how it connects into computer technology,
Mhm.
right? And how it connects into like AI and stuff like that. If I tell a system that I am looking for people who look like a certain group of people, right? Who are like performing like this, doing like that, etc. And that AI system now goes out and looks at a number of resumes and picks the people that it thinks are ideal based on that information that I used to train it. People will say, well, it's bias free because it's just looking for these qualities. Actually, it's not. We actually, by picking who we picked and who we call an exemplar and who we say, oh, look for people like this, we're already biasing the system, right?
Yeah.
So all of these systems are already set up with a certain amount of bias. The idea that here's one classic idea. There are two schools of thought in terms of who you look for to fit into a particular job. Do you look for someone who is similar to the other people that you have, fit? Or do you look for someone that's different from the other people you have, who then adds on something to the group? Depending on how you train that AI, it's either going to be looking for a lot of clones of the kind of people that you had before, or it's going to be looking for a lot of people that fill gaps that are not filled by the people that you had before.
Yeah.
But that's all under our control. Most organizations, when they create these programs, they err on the side of the latter, on the former rather, more than the latter. They're more likely to create systems that say, hey, look at the two Joes. They're really good at doing this. What are their qualities? And then look for other people that have those qualities as well, as opposed to saying, hey, look at the two Joes and the qualities they bring to the table, and look at the totality of what we need, and look for people that fill the gaps of what the two Joes don't have, right? Those are two different approaches. But the most common approach is looking for that exemplar that you're using. And in many cases, those exemplars are based on historical hiring patterns. What's that going to yield? It's going to yield more men than women. It's going to yield more people that belong to certain groups because that was the majority at the time that these hirings were made, right? So the system, it basically is being trained to do things using data that's already swayed a particular way.
So I know you uncovered some pretty big stuff in your industry. Do you want to dive into that or explain how you came across that?
Oh, give me a more specific example, because when you've been alive as long as I have, Joe,
because we're getting into
that opens up a whole door, of.
You're like, I don't want to say something I haven't talked about.
Exactly.
Well, it's just because we're on the topic of like bias and stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, weren't you kind of pivotal in spotting a discerning thing in a company that was doing something like this, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with a number of companies that have.
Just not sure how I can word it or what I'm allowed to say.
Yeah. No, I've worked with a number of companies where, in many cases, their intent really was. The intent is never to be. Most people don't want to be biased. I mean, let's give everybody that benefit of the doubt. People don't generally want to be biased, but what happened was they accidentally fall into traps. Like I remember one company that I worked with, who will remain unnamed, but they were one of many. One company. One of the things that I asked them for was, how they hired people and stuff like that. We were just having a discussion. There must have been like 30 people in the room. And they said, well, we are very objective because we use a criteria to determine who we're going to hire. And that criteria, is something that guarantees that we're going to get the kind of people that can succeed here. I said, okay, great. What's your criteria, right? So they started calling it out. A lot of them knew it by memory. They were pretty senior, right? They knew their criteria by memory. Well, somebody who's a self-starter, somebody who blah, 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 all the stuff that you hear all the time people talking about. And, I'm filling up a whiteboard, a piece of flip chart paper with all these different things. Then I took out a red pen and a green pen, and I asked them as part of the exercise, let's do this now. Let's circle everything that is objective in green and everything that is subjective in red. And for purposes of definition, a really simple definition, something that is objective is something we can all agree on, something that we can either all see, physically touch, like, this is a pen. That's objective, right?
Yeah.
So really objective. Let's get down to concrete. I can touch it, feel it, see it with one of my senses. It's there, right? And for subjective purposes, what we're going to do is, if something does not fit that criteria, if the criteria is anything other than that, meaning that, well, we've always done it that way, or we feel very strongly about it, or in looking at people who are successful, like Joe, we've noticed that he has this particular quality. All those things are really subjective, right? They're not really as concrete as that pen I just showed you. So with that definition, I had them all go through each one of the things that they mentioned were part of their success criteria and that they use to look for people to work in their companies. And, what we ended up having was a lot of red. Of red, maybe one or two greens. Why? Because things like self-starter, that's subjective. What do you call a self-starter versus me, right? My self-starter might be, for you, a laggard, right?
That's interesting.
And also it varies from organization to organization.
What are some more examples, though? Give me some more examples. Like self-starter.
Well, for example, you could have someone in an organization who's thought of as being a real team player. What does that mean? Like, who decides that?
Yeah.
And how is it that what you see as a team player and I see as a team player is supposed to be, no matter how you define it, there are going to be differences based on how you were brought up, how I was brought up, the experiences I had, the experiences you had. And yet, if you look at a lot of organizations when they're justifying why they choose the way they choose, 90% of their choice is based on these very subjective beliefs that they then treat as if this was the gospel truth, as if this were objectivity at its finest. And that is where bias creeps in. Bias creeps in that it's just basically our beliefs that certain things are a certain way. And most people are not aware that they're actually doing that.
Do you ever find pushback against that? Because it seems like you could be creeping on maybe people that don't want to admit to these things, or maybe they want to keep the status quo. So I'm curious if you ever come across that. Or
yeah, you'll always run across an occasional pushback. So I usually say to people, look, I'm open to learning. Here's the pen, there's the flip chart, make your case, right? But a lot of times their case is more of a feeling than it is an actual. Most people, I would say most people do not intentionally, say, you know what, I'm going to hire men because I think they're better for this job than women. And, because I'm biased, most people don't do that. What they do is they rationalize their feelings by saying things like, well, our criteria is blah, 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 blah. But when you get behind the criteria, a lot of times you'll find that the criteria is subjective. And so what I like to do is, in discussions like that, is to go to the very criteria itself and have them look at it and have them explain, and basically explain whether it's objective or subjective, see the result, and then after that, I'm not going to say to them, you're acting in a biased way or not. I'll let the chart speak for itself, and I'll let them look at it. And my goal at that point is not to get everybody to acquiesce or say, oh, you know what, you got me. I do all these terrible things. I've never seen that happen, nor do I expect it to happen. But I think what happens is people leave the room, right? And it makes them think. And if I did that, then I succeeded. Because if the person starts to think, it's within that process of considering and thinking, at least in my experience, every time someone, knocked one of my ideas into a spin, that was something that in the back of my head, I just kept going back to, because we all try to then recreate that sense of, that sense of alignment, right? So if you can get the person thinking, you've got them then in a place that's good for them, because that the objective is not to prove that they're wrong or whatever. I'm sure people can prove I'm wrong on certain things as well. But when you realize that something doesn't mesh very well, that thinking is what causes you to evolve.
It makes me curious how you're supposed to like be a better filter, because don't you have to hire people or like have a good sense of judgment? So what is that like whenever you're maybe recruiting, or you have to trust others to do what you do?
Yeah, I mean, when you're recruiting, in many cases, what you're looking is for someone to do a particular job, right? To do a particular function. And I think that sometimes there are two things that get conflated. And that is that this job needs to be done, true, and it needs to be done in this particular way. Not necessarily so, right? So I could find someone who could accomplish maybe what I can accomplish in a particular mission or a particular outcome, but yet might do it in a totally different way because they have a different skill set than I have, or they have a different set of experiences, or they have a different set of resources that are available to them. So I think in organizations, sometimes when they're looking for people to do a particular job and they're looking for someone who can succeed at that job, I think something that gets in the way is this whole idea that, well, Joe, if you're going to do this, then you have to know what I know, be able to do what I do, and to produce the result that I produce. Not necessarily so.
That's a good point. I feel
I
like
think
I feel like that sometimes.
we all do to some degree. I think it's just part of the, but I think it's just part of the way that the brain works or the way we think sometimes. But if you look at, let's say, for example, I recently read something I thought was really fascinating. It was about people that were like highly successful. And I forget I wish I could remember the article, I'd share it with you, but it was about the fact that if you took all these people that are thought of as being like highly successful, in terms of how they've built their wealth and other things that they've done and so forth, you'd find that despite the effort that goes into creating articles for magazines where you say, well, here are the 10 traits that all successful people have, or here are the 5 things that all people that blah, blah, blah do or have. The fact of the matter is that there are people that are almost equally successful and yet approach everything in a totally different way.
And probably have less than you.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's a matter of, there are many paths, that get to where you might want to go. And the best path for you is the path that plays to your strengths and the path that utilizes what you bring to the table. Different people, different
Are you
ways.
a free will or destiny person? Because we're talking about paths right now,
Yeah, I'm more of a free will person. I'm more of I think that we make choices. And yet, as I say that, it's so funny. As I say that, I always leave
Here
room.
It comes.
Here it comes. Because there are areas where I know, it's like I know the known, but I don't know the unknown, right? And the fact of the matter is that there are so many
belief systems, right?
Belief systems and uh, different ways of looking at us that in some cases say, well, we look at things and we evaluate the information, and based on experiences and feelings that we have mixed in with that, we make decisions. And then there are other belief systems that say, we're kind of like pre-programmed to do things a certain way, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, there have been experiments where they've taken somebody and they've stimulated a certain part of their brain, and it makes them like something or not like something, or want something or not, and it leaves a question there. So my preference is that we do make these choices and so forth, but I think the jury's out on how much of that we have full power over, and how much of that is more of destiny, and how much of that is built into the DNA
For sure.
string that we got from our parents, and how it got encoded together.
Do you find anything that's like particularly like pervasive that you see in all companies, no matter where you go, that maybe you would in one sentence try to dispel it and get rid of it everywhere, like because you're just tired of seeing it and maybe it's inescapable in some way?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I would love to dispel, in fact, it's one of the things that I try very hard to dispel with a lot of the work that I do, is this notion that that DEI efforts in organizations, right, are about about helping someone else who is, basically disadvantaged, and that the organization is kind of bringing them into their bosom and helping them along because it's a good company. And, it's like, to me, I think that's very, it's very paternalistic.
Mm-hmm.
Right, for one
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the bottom line is that we as human beings, in organizations or groups of any kind, always perform better when we're able to utilize the best out of each other. We're always going to do better. If you can get the best out of me and I can get the best out of you, we're a great team, right? And I think that organizations that are competing with organizations want to make sure that they're getting the best out of everybody they've got inside that building or inside that structure, whether it's physical or non-physical. And that to do that, you need to you need to take into account the way different people function, what they bring to the table, and then leverage it and utilize it. If you've got an organization where you've got, let's say, for example, 100 salespeople, and of those 100 salespeople, let's say, for example, 50 are men and 50 are women, and most of the men are knocking it out of the park and the women aren't. Well, all things being equal, then maybe that means that these guys are doing a better job. But if you look behind the scenes and you see that most of the let's say reimbursement programs are set up to cover things that are expenses normally incurred by men, like taking out a client for drinks or to the baseball game or whatever, and that there is nothing that's reimbursable that covers expenses that sometimes are incurred by women, especially when they become mothers and they have children at home and so forth, like childcare and stuff like that. Then you realize that there's a reason why the men are outperforming the women. The system is set up to support them and not to support her. And as a company, I want everybody to perform at the top of their game. I don't want just the men to outperform the women because of historical advantage that I've given them. I want everybody. So I would then look at that system and say, okay, how do I make that system so that if there are differences, they're differences because of the inheritability that these people bring to the table, and not because the system is set up historically to support one group more than the other.
Which in my research, I have noticed a lot of the problems are systematic. They all are historic, and it may be legislation, some law, something that was passed a long time ago that's still affecting today. Is that the same with the workplace, do you feel?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Most workplaces, especially let's say in the United States, most workplaces have practices in place that came into existence around the mid 1950s or so. So if you look at the 1950s, if you want to take a blast to the past real quick and see the world of the 1950s, just tune into Leave It to Beaver or one of those shows, right? Dad dispensing wisdom, mom is always in the kitchen, he has a job, and Wally and Beaver are off to school. Or you could look at, one of the other shows like the Ozzie and Harriet show, that form of family and structure that existed at the time, that a lot of these policies and practices were created in organizations, were designed around the idea of of supporting people, adequately, providing benefits that matter to them. Also in the United States, primarily, the nuclear family was a big thing. So unlike other countries where they have more extended families that include grandparents and other people, these families were mom, dad, and the kids, right? So the benefits cover mom, dad, and the kids. So now the United States is demographically changing, the workforce is changing, but yet in many organizations, the policies and practices they have hail back to the days of Leave It to Beaver. So now, let's say, for example, as a friend of mine who is a consultant and an author told me recently, she said, it was really interesting that my younger brother, when my younger brother came to live with me, she said, I could marry a total stranger and he would immediately be under my benefits. But my brother couldn't be under my benefits because that's not included in the policy and practice of the organization. Because the thinking is that the nuclear family is mom, dad, and the kids, right? The other thing is, like, let's say, for example, you also have a lot of the policies that are set up for a working male. And the needs they have to cover their family and so forth. It's ward, from Leave It to Beaver. But today you have a lot of women who are head of households, and the processes were not set up as well for them. So in many cases, it's really a matter of organizations modernizing for the workforce they have now. Unfortunately, the majority of the workforce that is at the middle to the bottom of the organization is nothing like the workforce that is at the top of the organization. So sometimes there's a disconnect in terms of, this fellow has to go home to take care of his kids and his wife works. And the more senior person who's been around for a while goes like, why can't his wife take care of the kids so he can focus on his job? Right?
I'm curious if you're seeing more or less value in your work with like technology and in the future, like how you anticipate the changes.
Oh, I think that, well, first of all, let me answer this question this way. The kind of work that I do today that others did before me, I think others will continue doing after me, deals with very universal conditions that impact people, and have impacted people forever. Ever since, the beginnings of history, there are groups of people who have an in-group, and then there are out-groups. And then these groups mix together, and they form a country or a state or a company, and now they have to negotiate between differences in language, habits, behaviors, beliefs, etc. And I don't think that that's ever going to go away. I think that's inherent to us. I think what might change is what are the specific things that we're dealing with, the particular topics that we're dealing with. Those might change as organizations and countries and so forth evolve, and you have changes there. But this ongoing, how do people work more effectively together across different barriers of language, beliefs, habits, and so forth? I think that's just part of the human condition. So I think that that's going to continue for a while. I think as we go forward, some of the things that are changing, like, for example, a lot of organizations believe that they have to put certain programs in place so that they can comply with laws to support a particular minority group or women, etc. Well, just look at the census and the numbers and where they're going. In the next couple of years, by the year 2045, people who are considered minorities in the United States collectively will be the majority. So now what happens is, in that shift, organizations need now to be able to engage people that belong to these groups that used to be minorities, not so much because they're trying to be a nice company and help, but because that's who their workforce is going to be. And if those people don't feel comfortable in their company and they decide to go to a competitor, they lose talent, right? They lose talent. So I think that these dynamics will continue to evolve over time. And I think that, but you'll always have the in group, the out groups, and that's just part of human nature. We've been doing that since a man or a woman came out of a cave and one of them grunted one way and the other one grunted the other way, and they said, "Oh, wait a minute, you might be the enemy."
Yeah.
So I think that that's just part of the human condition, where we have that. Now, who is the out group? Who is the in group? And how are the dynamics of these things? That varies. For many years, it varied from country to country. Because we were separated as societies. So what in America might have been thought of as, someone who belonged to, a higher level caste versus a lower level caste was very different from, let's say, India and what they thought in their caste system and so forth. But as we come closer together, these things are merging now. Just like tribes merged into villages and villages merged into cities and cities into countries, and now communications, electronic communications and other things are merging us together as humans.
This brings into question a really interesting dynamic, because how do you tie in international working with people when you're trying to be inclusive with all the diversity? You have to be culturally sensitive. There's a lot of things to take into account if you're doing business overseas.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But before you answer too,
sure.
though, since I haven't really asked about your background in business and stuff, I'm curious if you can just elaborate how you got started, and then maybe like your first break, or how you noticed this was like what you were meant to do. Maybe you made money, crazy story, something.
Yeah. So no, what happened was essentially, when I was growing up, right, I was going to college and I had to pick a topic, and I thought, I like numbers, so I'll take accounting. I mean, that was what went into the decision. It was that's as shallow as you can get, right? So I basically took business and accounting, and then later on went to worked in a lot of primarily brokerage houses in the beginning, and opened the books, closed the books, and after a couple of cycles of that, said, "Wow, I just can't see myself doing this for the rest of my life." But I was fortunate that there was a group of people around the time of consultants that were literally converting a lot of the old practices that organizations had that were manual. They were making them computer programs. They were basically programming them. And I was tapped by my boss at the time, who was the CFO, to work with this group and to help them to automate. And I thought, something else to add to my workload. But actually, I ended up enjoying it because I saw what they were doing, and I thought, like, that's really fascinating how you could take something that took 20 people to do, and you could reduce it to a program that does this stuff. So I switched over into that particular area. I switched over into doing more of the work as a systems and financial liaison. And essentially for the next couple of years or so, I worked with companies automating a lot of their financial processes. And then around that time, I realized, like, there's much more to this, world of, of basically programming stuff and running it on computers. So I got more involved with that. I ended up going to another organization where I literally ran IT operations for them. And in that role, I was able to literally be the one that had other people go out and automate stuff and, and put it into these programs. And, as I was doing all this, I just realized that the people that we were bringing in to the organization, we were beginning to have trouble in terms of filling all the seats that we needed to fill. And I was, wanted to tap into a larger workforce. And I discovered that, one day I'm sitting around and I'm looking at the names of the people who work for me. And I realized all my managers are men. right? And in fact, most of the programmers and so forth. And I'm like, and I started doing a little bit of sleuthing, and I found out, well, ladies wanted to get into this, but they couldn't find their way in. It was like, it was literally a boys' club. And so I started working with other groups to find out why. And, I just my curiosity led me in different directions. Anyway, just to jump ahead to the conclusion of this little piece, I discovered what it was that literally acted as a strainer that kept a lot of women from getting into those roles. Made a couple of changes to some of our efforts that we had in training and development, and our pipeline exploded, and we were able to take on more clients because we had a bigger bench, right? And we had more and more women that were also getting involved and that were part of this process. And it was around that time then that the CEO of the larger country organization said, hey, you know what, we're starting this process. And, you're not from HR. And that's why I think you're perfect for it, because you're going to come at it and look at it from a different way. And I thought, like, oh, that sounds interesting, right? So I started doing that, and lo and behold, that became my passion. It was something that actually allowed me to utilize a lot of the different things that I did in the past. Yeah.
What's crazy about your story is the things that stuck out to me are you didn't expect it, didn't want to do it, curiosity led you to it, found your passion.
Yeah.
So is that not a manual rule book for people who are like, how do I find what I love?
Yeah.
You don't know. You can accept the most random thing. You might not be into it at first. There's so much there to unpack.
Yeah, there is. And, in a lot of cases, what happens is that you judge things. When you're judging things without doing them, you're looking at them from the standpoint of, I don't think I'd like to do that. But you really don't know until you do it. And conversely, there are a lot of things that you might think in life, it looks like it's a really interesting thing to do. And then when you get into it, you're like, this is not exactly what I expected. My accounting story, right? So what happens is that I think a lot of times, unfortunately, people get stuck because they feel like, well, I made a commitment and this is what I'm doing now. And I got an accounting degree and I've been doing this for a year and this is my career track. And I think, what I did that was slightly different, and I think that it worked out for me, is I followed my passion. I went into things thinking, I think I'd like to do that. That would really be great. Then I did it, and I'm like, oh, this is not quite what I thought it would be when I was actually doing it. It's a good thing to know. Certainly, it's a good thing to know finance and know numbers and that. But do I want to open the books and close the books repetitively for the remainder of my life? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
So I started delving into other areas, and then I discovered, oh, you know what? This is really interesting. Or, my boss asked me to do something. I was like, I'm not too crazy about it, but what the heck, And then after I was in it, I realized that what I thought it would be like and what it was really like were two different things. So, my advice to anybody who hears this in terms of getting to that place is don't judge things from afar and say like, oh, no, I'm this kind of person, I'm going to stay here. Try things out. Like it's different. Doing is very different from visualizing something from afar. And the other is that if you want to get to your place of where you feel like you're really doing the best that you can, you're hitting it out of the park, and you're enjoying what you're doing, you need to be open to stepping out of the box, as it were, as opposed to saying, well, I made this decision and the only next logical choice is this. Not really. No.
I want to loop back to that, just asking about international, business. If you have to, I'm thinking of examples where maybe you're dealing with people through webcam and you're doing meetings with tons of different people, and your opinion on outsourcing too, because this is a funny example, but recently I tried to pay somebody and they were in another country, and it was the first time I had the experience of, what do you mean my dollar's converting less? I don't know what you're talking about. It was like so insulting. And then I had this whole outer body like, wait, is this what other countries feel when they can't just work with us or get anything? It made me feel so low for a moment. And I was like, anyways, they ended up working with me anyway and accepting the budget. But it was just, what are your thoughts on international business and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, international business is just becoming business because there there rarely is a team these days where you don't see someone who's logging in from somewhere in Asia and another person's logging in from somewhere in South America. So I mean, I think that is becoming more and more of the norm. I think talent is going to become more and more portable. I think even people like, for example, there are tons of people that were born and raised in the United States, but they decided that they'd be happier living in Portugal. And they go over there and they work remotely. And of course, where you live and where you work is going to have an impact on you as a person, how you interact. So I think that's becoming more and more of the norm. Um, you know, I think that we're evolving to a place where that's going to become more normal. Um, it already is somewhat normal, or it's become normalized. Like having conversations like we're having, like this, online. But I think that with virtual reality and other experiences like that, it's just going to become more and more normalized. And I think that all of us at some point need to realize that most of the things that we believe are a certain way are based on things that we've learned within a system, and that there are other systems out there, and that we need to begin to see how to bridge those together so that we can work more effectively together. I think that what we're doing now at a global scale is what people did in the past at a tribal scale. Yeah, two tribes get together, they form a village. And then they have a rival village. They don't trust them too much, but eventually they find new ways to bind with each other. They become a state. I think we're gradually becoming a planet, right, in terms
Yeah,
of our society. But it takes time and effort, and it takes an evolution of the way we think and the way we see each other and the way we connect with each other. I think that's changed. I hope that answered
I
your question, but
yeah,
I just
I suppose it's really about like the idea of so many different cultural backgrounds, right? And then we're trying to work toward a common goal that seems far fetched, but we're just supposed to rely on, well, we all understand the same English language.
yeah. I mean, I think that we need to become more aware of those cultural differences
Because
than we did in the past. In
just
the
in, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I'm just
Go
trying to
ahead.
think of just an example, like Japanese culture. They expect you to know their children, their family. They want to come to your home
Correct.
and get to know you and really
Correct.
build a lifelong relationship. And trying to think of other cultures. Just that's just an example.
Spanish
Yeah,
are like that too. Yeah, the
correct. Or many
Spanish.
many African cultures, they're super family oriented, so it's just
Yes.
a normal thing to ask, like, how's your family been, as like a common courtesy. And a lot of Americans would never even, it's just like, hey, what's up, what's on the agenda, are we done
Right.
with that? And when it comes to business, Americans are known for being shrewd, by the books, financials, super stern, no other way to look at it. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, like, a lot of these countries may be looking at us as a bad example for finances, but then they mimic us because we're setting the stage for how to treat everybody else.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, I think we have an outsized influence because of some of the tools that we've developed. I mean, let's face it. A lot of AIs that get exported from the United States, right? So, and the elements that are put into it are basically from that particular culture. But you know, I think that as we as we evolve, like as we evolve and we become more socially connected with each other, um, the question, I think the core question is, what is the objective as a human? What is our objective? Is our objective to be very productive? Is our objective to be satisfied and happy as people? Is our objective, what is our objective, right? And if we zero in more on those commonalities, then we can find ways to kind of smooth out, the other pieces that maybe prevent us from getting there. I've worked with people from all around the world, so I know exactly what you're talking about. It's like, I've worked with, Germans for many years. And Germans, in the beginning, they're not as how shall I say it? They're not as chummy as Americans are. With Americans, hey, how are you? And so forth. It's like Germans are more like, I don't know you. Right. But if we work together, and because of the places I worked in the past, I have a lot of friends that are German, and and some of those friendships run really deep, and they are the result of them getting to know me better and me getting to know them better. I think that where we sometimes have challenges as the world grows smaller through technology and people connecting with each other, where we sometimes have challenges is if we believe that our system of belief that was developed as a result of our experiences, our tribal experiences of our ancestors and how we develop things, that those are the only way and are the truth. And that everything else is a deviation from that. I think that prevents us from connecting with other people. When we recognize that other people are the product of their own experiences as families, as a group, and so forth, living in different parts of the world, dealing with different situations, and that there are some benefits to some of the ways that they look at the world. Because let's face it, you look at something from one angle, you see something, but you don't see others. You look at it from another angle, you're missing this piece, but you see other things. I think all those perspectives are valid. And I think that we as a human race become enriched as we begin to appreciate that there are benefits to all those different elements and all those different perspectives, and that ours is just one of many. And I've, due to travel and living in another country, as I mentioned earlier, for certain pieces of my life, and coming in contact with so many people from so many different walks of life, have seen probably a fraction of those, but probably more than people who live in an isolated group where everyone else belongs to the same group they do, have similar experiences. I think that we are reaching a point where, as a result of being able to communicate the way we're communicating and having companies and jobs that span across the globe, where we're just basically bumping into each other a little bit, just like those cave people that belong to different tribes eventually formed a nation. It's a process of growing toward each other, and I'm optimistic that we'll do it at some point, but we're at the very beginning of that process.
I noticed that this is kind of ironic, but as a kid, grew up Catholic, religion was kind of shoved down my throat a little too much, so I kind of lost interest with it, right? But as I grew up and meeting people of different cultures and backgrounds, I always noticed that in my head, the questions I would want to gravitate toward immediately were always like, does he know that I know that there's like 4 different cultures and religions in their country, that I don't assume all this about them like everybody else is, but I can't bring that up in conversation. And it's funny though, because like how deterred and turned off I am from that type of conversation, but I'll find myself wanting to relate to that person, to be like, are these your beliefs? Can we talk about them? What do you believe? And I won't even engage because I'm like, it's taboo.
Yeah. There's and an interesting thing is, I always find that it's good to know where where a person's belief systems come from, or their history, because not because I think, this belief is right or this belief is wrong, but it gives you some context as to where that person is coming from, and what shapes them. Like, I'll share with you, because you brought up the topic of religion. So I was brought up Catholic also. But very young, I was always very curious. So I am probably in a small percentage of people, because I've actually read the Bible from cover to cover.
Wow.
And yeah, it was something I undertook when I was very young, and I made it a mission to do it, and I just like worked my way through it, and it blew my mind a little bit when I finished it, because I realized like some of the basic messages, some of the information, it's so powerful in terms of
Universal truth almost.
universal truths. Yeah, it was so powerful that I went back and I read it one more time. I literally did read it one
What
more
stuck
time.
with you? What stuck with you the most?
I think the thing that stuck with me the most was like I tend to quote a lot of like Jesus' sayings and stuff, because I find that there was such powerful universal truths in a lot of the things that he said, like um things like as simple, I mean, some of these things they're not like new revelations or anything, but when he said things along the lines of, hey, before you try to take the straw out of your brother's eye, take the rafter that's in your eye out first, which brings home the fact that, a lot of times we believe that, I know something that Joe doesn't know, but, you know, I'm not looking at all my own blank spots that I have, right? Um, there were various teachings in there about how people treated each other, how people related to each other, what people thought of a teacher. When he talks about the fact that when he was when he went back to Bethlehem and he got up and he spoke in front of the congregation, that they were sitting there and they were saying, like, isn't that guy Joseph and Mary's son who grew up here as a kid and whatever? And when his followers and him were walking out, they said, I don't think that they took to heart what you said. And he said, a prophet is never accepted in his own hometown, literally, right? I thought like those were all like very powerful lessons. They're interesting lessons about, it's very insightful lessons about the human condition.
That's
And
interesting.
the Bible is full of stories like that.
I didn't know that came from there. I've heard that quote and didn't even know it was in the Bible.
Yeah, no, the Bible is full of stories like that. But it's interesting enough. I mean, like, am I a big churchgoer? No, but that doesn't stop me from appreciating the wisdom in something like that.
Absolutely.
And and I think that
and you don't have to be the most spiritual person to appreciate it, is what you're getting at, right?
No. I mean, and I think the spirituality itself is more of becoming more self-aware of. You become more self-aware. You begin to think about what you're thinking about instead of just saying, I see this, therefore it's the truth. You're kind of like, well, I see that, but what are the conditions that make me see it that way?
The quote you said too about pulling out of the eyes, it makes me think about how often that we try to impose our own beliefs on others, right? That's really the essence of it.
We do. So in most cases, what we try to do is, and by we, I include myself, because I catch myself doing it all the time. And if I don't catch myself, my wife will tell me I'm doing it. So I've always got somebody.
I've made up my mind.
That's somebody to level set me, But yeah, but what happens is a lot of times we become very attached to a certain way of looking at things, or it's very meaningful to us, or we feel like that this is right or this is wrong. Like even right now, all the different the polarization that exists in the world around us exists because people attach themselves to different ideas and they're not open to an idea that's different from theirs. And so they're essentially, what they're doing is they're fighting over something as simple as, I think that's red, and you say, no, it's kind of purple, and that's the big war right there. It's over differences in perception about things around us. And fact is that that different perceptions just give us, I'm thinking of a story I wanted to share with you to illustrate that even better. You ever hear the story of the elephant and the different people that are touching the elephant Okay, so one person touches the trunk and they think it's a giant hose. And the other person touches the legs and they think they're pillars. And another person touches the tail and they think it's a spring. Another person touches the hide and they think it's some kind of big vehicle or this, big rock or whatever. And they're each convinced that they have the truth, when in reality, if they put all their pieces together, the truth would emerge from that.
Wow.
Right? That this is an elephant, when you say, what is something in common that we're all touching from different angles, that has like columns holding it up, has a real leathery part, has like a little springy thing over here, has big floppy ears, and has like a long hose coming out of it. It doesn't take a lot of genius to realize that this is probably an elephant, right? But everybody instead is trying to convince, no, it's a hose. And they're arguing with the other person who says, no, it's a column.
I'm trying to think of
different ends.
I'm trying to think of the deeper metaphor here. Is it like the example of holding out knowledge? You're not sharing what you know. When unified, it would just be collective strength.
Yeah, I think it's along the lines of that we all have different perspectives that come from our experience and from what we see. And that's fine that we have that. What becomes a problem is when we begin to believe that our angle of seeing things is the only one, and that we have the ultimate truth, and no one else does, right?
When we're all probably right in some way or another.
And somewhere or another, we're all right, and maybe we're partially wrong. So today you have a lot of different people that argue against each other, especially here in the United States, about DEI, pro it, against it.
I am curious your thoughts on what you would tell your younger self.
Oh, my younger self. Oh, God. I have thought about that So my younger self, what I would say is try different things faster, experiment faster. Because I think sometimes I like, for example, I would stay in a particular role or do something because I was hesitant to make the change. And actually the change proved to be beneficial. So I would say experiment more broadly, be willing to flex and change a little faster, and continue learning from all the people around you. Continue asking questions and learning. I have to say, every time that I've done workshops and I stood up with a group of people, I was supposed to be the teacher, and I was, and I had 40 people in there, but some of the questions they asked, they got me thinking, and they took me to a different place, because this person was looking at this, but with a different lens, right? And I think that is where all of us can benefit, is by being more open to each other and listening to each other a little more, and not automatically discounting that, no, it's not a column. It's a hose.
That's actually a good quote. No, that's a really good quote. But I was going to ask your like, if you had a round table of people that you could put around you and you could ask like anything you wanted, who would they be? And then maybe just who do you look up to in terms of inspiration, and who are you reading about, things like that? Who inspires you?
That's a big list. That's a big list. So, I mean, a lot of the DEI stuff that I think about and talk about today, one of my initial inspirations was a fellow by the name of Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, who wrote a book, Building a House for Diversity. And he used a really good analogy in that book that just made a lot of big points stick out. He was way ahead of his time. A lot of people back then were talking about diversity as just increasing the variety of people that you had in the organization. They weren't talking as much about inclusion, which later on they started talking about, and they weren't talking about equity, which is more of creating a more balanced support for everyone in the organization. He talked about all of that back in the 1990s, right?
Wow.
So he kind of like saw all of this as a big picture. So him. And I mean, my reading, I mentioned before, having read the Bible from cover to cover twice, but philosophers like, Ralph Waldo Emerson and, Essay on Self-Reliance. I mean, it's like flooding my mind right now with different books that I've read, different people that I've encountered over the years who shaped my thinking. I think the important thing is no matter how long you're doing a particular job or you're in a particular field, and no matter how much you are looked at as being the expert in a particular area, you need to always be open to that thing that's new, that's odd, that's different, that makes you go, and that's going to take you to another level, right? And you'll continue to go to other levels so long as you're open to that. And I think in the world we're in today, with all the electronic communications and all the availability of exchanges, the only thing that prevents people from learning from each other is closing their minds. Because it's there, it's available to you. Like
I'm
we're having this
curious.
conversation across an expanse of several miles right now.
Yeah. I'm curious how the media, you feel, plays a role into all this, like in the workplace, even if it's fictional media. What's your interpretation?
Oh, the media plays a big piece in everything. The media, even though, let's say, for example, I was talking about that, old 1950s TV show, Leave It to Beaver, right? That show wouldn't fly very well today, right?
Yeah.
But back then, that show served to create an image of what normal was. Mom, dad, and the kids, right? Or normal in the context of what was considered the average American family back then. Whether that existed really or not is irrelevant. What's relevant is that people would watch the show and they would go like, that's what they aspired for. When they got married, they wanted to have their wife, they'd move, they'd get a house, they'd have the kids, dad would say wise things and mom would cook, right? And that dominated, that shaped the thinking of people. I think that the media can do a lot to shape the way people think and see things. I think it plays a big role. I think that to some degree, the movies and the shows that we see reflect certain realities that exist, although they may not be as ubiquitous as the media makes them seem. And changes in the media also reflect changes in us in terms of how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. I mean, there are a lot of people, today whose entire way of thinking was probably shaped by Star Trek, right?
That's
or,
fair.
or
It's fair.
or it might have been shaped by some other programs that they saw that spoke to them and that gave them a certain outlook. So I think that there's a two-way communication going on. I think that obviously, in order to be able to sell products and services to us, the media wants to create programs that capture our attention and that hold our attention. But I think by the way that they use those programs and display people, they're also shaping society. So there's this two-way effect going on, that where society is being shaped by media and society is shaping media.
I kind of feel like out of everything we talked about, that would be worth writing a book about.
Yeah,
Have you ever thought about writing a book?
I have written books. I wrote one called The New DEI and ERG Frontier, and another one called Supercharge Your ERGs. And I've written some other things as well. But
do you feel they're still current? How recent are they?
The last one that I mentioned, the New DEI and ERG Frontier, that one came out in 2022. Or no, I'm sorry. Yeah, 2022, because 2020. Yeah, 2022.
Definitely current then.
It's current. That one's current. Supercharge Your ERGs, which is about resource groups, that came out, I'm going to say now, that's been around probably, the date escapes me, but I think that's been around since maybe for about 10 years now, or 9 years.
Would you say that that's what made you an authority on the topic?
Well, what I would say is that to some degree, yes, the books did help because people became more aware of my work. I write for Forbes and for Fast Company also, so my work is out there as well. So yeah, writing definitely does get people to see you as an authority on a particular topic. I think that one of the things, though, that that for me really got me to connect more with a lot of people on this topic was when I started looking more at where are we going, as opposed to where have we been or where are we right now. And so a lot of my writing, especially in that last book, is more about where are we going? Where is it that society is going in general? We're definitely becoming more diverse, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. We're becoming more interconnected and more global. That's for sure. We're also becoming more automated than we were in the past. The things like, for example, who can work from home, the definition of who fits in that category or the people who fit in that category are changing dramatically, because it used to be, well, if you're a knowledge worker, you can work from home, but if you're stacking pallets in the factory, then you have to be on premises. Not necessarily anymore with droid robots that you can operate with a joystick and a headset, right? Yeah. So all of these things are changing. And I think that's the area where I spend most of my time, my mental time in, is where are we going and how do we make sure that we're ready for it, so that when we get there, we're not caught with systems and solutions that have to be broken and rebuilt, but rather, because we're looking at the future, we've built systems and solutions that can scale.
Definitely. Winding down, last few questions here. Is there any kind of like research that if I ever did, you'd be kind of interested to read? Like, what could advance your field? What do you feel knowledge-wise would help? What would help you do your job better?
What would help me do my job better? I think that the areas that I'm most interested in have to do with the evolution of people, as like, as I mentioned before, from their origins of small groups to becoming larger and larger groups. Because I think the ultimate thing that we're moving toward is more like of a earth-wide society. And the dynamics of that, like how do we, using these primitive brains that were designed to be a hunter-gatherer, how do we evolve the tools that we need in order to be able to work together as a bigger, more connected society?
Interesting. If you could be one superhero, what do you think you would choose?
Oh, come on. That's easy.
To read minds or something, read people's feelings.
No, it's easy. It's Superman. He can do everything. He can do, it's like, I remember when I was a kid, used to love comic books when I was a kid, but when they would have these, the section at the end where people would send questions in to the editors. And, as I said, I read these when I was a kid. And when I got older, I thought about that. And I thought, these guys were actually using these kids to brainstorm, right? Because the kids would ask questions like, well, you say Superman can fly because of the gravity, but how does he stay up there and just like not, fall, even though the gravity is weaker and so forth, etc. And they would come up
with
a
whole comic around it.
Yeah. They would build an explanation. They would build an explanation around this. They would say, well, Krypton's gravity was heavier, and therefore he needed special organs that allowed him to offset gravity. And it's like a bladder, I guess, that fills up with air. That and then they'd write a comic book about this, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that the creativity that they had, and the way that they were able to harness the imaginations of all these kids, that were reading this. So I always thought, like, when you asked that question, I said that because it was like, this was the person that could do everything.
For some reason, you couldn't figure out why.
Couldn't figure out why. And if you ask the question, well, how can he do this? They would go like, question, and they would, they were creative. I mean, they would come up with an answer that was plausible.
Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Whole Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. They were good at it. They were good. They were good at doing their answering those questions and making it seem perfectly logical. Which was really a feat. Yeah.
One of the things that I often say is that I believe AI is going to open doors for creatives for the future and just allow us to change the corporate landscape like we didn't expect. I just believe that creatives are finally going to be empowered to just who asks the best questions and what do you want to know? Because it's all about making it do what you want it to do. So I'm curious how you feel about creatives with artificial intelligence, the combination of the two.
I think it's powerful. I think it's very, very powerful because I think a lot of creatives have the imagination to conceive of things. And what slows them down is actually taking what's in here and putting it out here, right? I think that when a creative person uses an AI program, it magnifies their ability to come up with solutions and ideas because the AI, it literally offloads most of the heavy lifting grunt work, and it frees the creative to continue creating. Like, let's say, for example, if
you're just thinking all the brain power it would take for something.
Yeah. Like, think about this. Those book summaries that have been, for years, book summaries were around. There was a company that used to, if you became a member, they would send you summaries of books that you could read, and you could determine whether or not you wanted to buy the whole book, or maybe the summary was enough to highlight the main points. Well, the way that was done initially was, you had people who read the book, who were authors and writers, and they would sit down, they would summarize what they thought the bullets were, and then somebody else would edit it and so forth. Because it's a long process, right? Today, if you have 130, let's say you have a 150-page book, and you want to summarize that book, and let's say that each chapter is anywhere, some short chapters are 10 pages, a longer chapter might be 20 pages. You can literally go into ChatGPT, take the 10 pages, you could copy the 10 pages, and you could say, summarize the highlights of these 10 pages. And it'll produce, a response of maybe a paragraph or two. You copy that to a document. Then you take the next one, take half of it and say, summarize this half of this chapter, main points and bullets. Do the same thing with the other half. And if you did that, it'd probably take you about an hour and a half to 2 hours for a 150-page book. And then if you take that, which is probably going to be now 8 or 10 pages, and you say, turn that into a summary of what the book is primarily about and give me the highlights, you'd have it done like that, right? This was something that used to take a lot of people a lot of time to do in the past. So, I think that one of the most powerful things that these tools do is they allow people to be more creative. I don't know if you like, Marvel superhero movies, but to me, an example of how I think AIs make people more powerful and enable them to do more is, you have Tony Stark designing the Iron Man suit with Jeeves by explaining step by step what it is that he wants done.
That's good.
And then it's the AI that takes care of the details of how these servos need to be connected in order to make this arm work.
That's
or this leg work or whatever, right?
You just made me think Tony doesn't know as much as he knows.
Well, see, Tony is brilliant in that Tony can visualize.
He just knows what to ask.
He knows what to ask. He knows what he's looking for. And I think, to wrap this piece up for you, I think that the ability and the skill of knowing what to ask is going to become more and more valuable in the years to come as more and more machines are built and AIs are built that can actually do what they're asked to do, but the quality of what they produce will be predicated on the level and type of question asked by the asker, right? So better questions lead to better results, right? And so I think that that's going to become, and I think that that again is going to be an opportunity for all of humanity to actually benefit by pooling together our collective imaginations, because it's now creativity and productivity becomes less and less about what you do or what you produce with, but rather by the quality of what you ask for.
That's a pretty inspiring ending, not gonna lie. I was like, wow. No, really, like that was it. That's what I was looking for. That was good, because I've been saying this. I've literally been saying what you said. So I was like, wow, you just reconfirmed, validated what I've been thinking in other podcasts with other guests. So yeah, power what you say.
You can do so much today using the tools that exist today that years ago would have been like the searches that you can perform, and the way that you can combine. I can take a chat GPT and I could take two pieces of information that are disparate, and I can call one information A and call the other one information B, and say, take these 6 pages A and take these 6 pages of B and compare where there are similarities and contrasts, and highlight what the best choice is.
And then weave them together. Give me a narrative.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, can I do that? Sure, I could do it also.
Yeah, for sure.
But it would take me a long to do it. And all that time that I'm spending focusing on putting these pieces together, I'm not spending on interpreting, well, how can I use this knowledge that I have now? So I think that tools like AI, I'm actually pretty pro AI. I think tools like that actually free people.
You would be surprised how much I've heard people push back and say, yeah, but why don't you do it? Or they try to play, I like to authentically read and appreciate the person for what they're, and I'm like, okay, like at some point we got to get over that, because I have stuff to do.
Exactly. I have stuff to do. And to me, that sounds like the same argument.
Because it doesn't mean you don't appreciate them. Like if I did that with your book and I digested the knowledge and the work, how would you honestly feel about that?
Fine. You got what I wanted to transmit.
Not disrespecting the author in any way. You
got what I wanted you to learn. You got it. If you learned what I wanted you to learn, or what I was trying to convey, we've succeeded, right? Whether you read every word and every dot and every period, or it doesn't matter. What matters is the message, that you get the message.
Think that maybe books are going to get shorter now.
They might, but I think that the real power is in the ability to, what's happening is that
say more with less.
No? Our imagination is becoming more vital and more, our imagination and our ability to visualize and to see what isn't physically there by creating it, or by noticing that if you put this with this, it catalyzes into something. That's becoming more and more where we drive value, as opposed to spending our time, scratching a piece of paper with a pen to make shapes, right? So, I mean, I think that it is, it is a value. But what I was going to say to you before is that, people saying, well, it's, not the same. I want to appreciate the paper and the book and, all this other, there's always been this reluctance to let go of the way we did things in the past. But it's like, for example, a classic example is, when I got my first automatic transmission car when I was younger, and you had people that were older
making
than
fun
you.
of you, making fun of you.
Yeah, oh, come on, don't you like the feel of really working the machine because you clutch and you're doing the shifts and everything? And I'm like,
same automatic bicycle, same reaction.
I just want to get from point A to point B. If I could do
Yeah.
it better and faster, why not? Right?
Yeah.
They're romanticizing the means of doing something. Like today when I write, a lot of times when I write, I do type, but other times I just speak and the computer has a program that transfers my voice into words, right? But so basically what they're doing is they're romanticizing the process as opposed to, they'll say, well, I feel better and I feel more connected when I have a book in my hands. You'll get over it.
I feel, see, I'm trying to empathize though, and I feel the only way I can is if I try to bring music into this, right? Like I wouldn't want that to be so belittled to where I don't even need to get in the studio. I don't have to record. I don't need to write. It's already done with the push of a button. All the lyrics are typed out. Then I can understand, but I hate to, that just goes back to how art is subjective, right? Like in some sense, because we can romanticize pretty much anything as an excuse to not let us progress.
You can. It's like, for example, years ago, we're talking about science fiction before. Years ago, you need to have a bunch of wires and toggles, to carry an actor across a green screen to make him look like he was flying. Today, you can just CGI him in, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So, the thing is, it's like as a creator of knowledge or information, are you linked to the means by which you do it or to the product that you produce? I would say that some people might disagree with me, but I think it's the product. And if you could produce the product faster, better, and more effectively in some way,
here's my last
power
question.
to you.
I just want your opinion on this. So I'm about to release some research, tinyurl.com/jocat research, and you can check out all this type of different types of research I do. But this one specifically is on AI and time travel. And while it sounds super far-fetched, the idea is that I'm using all these white papers, gathering all my sources, creating tables of contents from that, and then beginning my research. And I'm advancing many different industries, but I'm just giving you the latest one I'm working on. What is your opinion on doing extreme, this may be over my head, may not even grasp it completely, but I'm doing it for others to take my work to advance their research so they can get ahead in the fields. What is the perception of that? And I can see so many people just backlash, like, he's not an expert. When I put in my work, I know I'm not an expert on this.
Right. So what's my feeling about that?
Yeah.
If you look throughout history, most of the people that made the biggest contributions to categories of science and business were not experts in the field that they were, because the experts already thought that they had the answers.
Interesting.
Right? And a lot of times the belief that you do something a certain way, it's like, for example, I think one of the classic simple examples is the example of air travel. So, the United States raised a certain amount of money. I forget the name of the person they gave it to. I think an airport is named after him, but they gave it to this guy who's supposed to be really a brilliant scientist and so forth, and said, let's, explore and examine how to build a machine that flies, what later on became an airplane. And he spent the money and he attempted different things and he went through a lot of different theories, and he was an expert in engineering of his time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't get very far. And then somewhere in the Carolinas, you have two guys who build bikes who decide to take one bike, outfit it with, a wingspan, and then drive into the wind, and they achieve lift, right? And the Wright brothers, that's pretty much the story of how they came up with the idea of the airplane. And so they accomplished on a low budget, as two guys who owned the bike store, who decided to take the bike and with a bunch of wires and pulleys and whatever and put wings on it to try to move into the wind, literally making themselves into a kite so that they could achieve flight, right? And you had another guy who had a nice budget and support of the government and everything and had all the right credentials and so forth, who couldn't crack the code. And I think that the perspective that people offer from, depending on what your perch is and how you're looking at things, I think that when connected with other perspectives from other people and other ideas, I think that's where creativity comes from. I've seldom seen examples where an insider who is considered to be, he's really knowledgeable or she's really knowledgeable in that area, came out with something that turned their own industry upside down. Generally, it's an outsider who does that because they come in and they look at things with a fresh perspective and they don't have the usual biases, so they look at it more objectively, right? And then someone else looks at it, and then somebody comes along who goes, if you take that and that, put it together, you create this other thing. It's like, who was the other one? The other one, I'm thinking way back, like in the 1400s, guy who used to work in a, what do you call it? He worked in the shop where they made coin mints. Back then they would take the hot metal and they would print the coin. And he also worked with another group of people that used these different types of barrels to create like lithographs or whatever. Well, he created little pieces of print, put it all together, and you have Gutenberg's printing machine, which began the whole printing revolution, right? Wow. He wasn't an expert in, he just happened to be working in one thing and working in the other, and he had a flash of insight that said, if I put these two things together,
convenience.
I can then print pamphlets one at a time by stamping them, just like you would stamp a coin, but do it with movable print. And that's literally what the printer was. It was just movable print, created very similar to the way a coin mint worked, and placed on this other, like a wine press type machine. So wine press, coin mint pieces, you have the printer. So most good ideas actually come from experiences that are from diverse corners of the world, and not generally because, you're an expert in that particular topic. The expert sometimes has blinders in that area.
You just had me wondering if people were printing newspapers in other centuries right now.
Yeah.
I'm like, it could have been. Maybe there was another printer.
Could have been. Just because Gutenberg was the one that
we know.
That's we know about it. We don't know if somebody else did this. I mean, it's very possible. Very possible.
Where can everybody find your stuff online? And do you have social media or anything?
Yeah, sure. So my website is joesantana.com. So really easy to find me. And I'm on LinkedIn. I am, again, very easy to put my name in there, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on X and also on Facebook. So you can find me in almost any of those. And I share a lot of the information that I put out there. In fact, I have a weekly newsletter on DEI that I put out also. So if anybody wants that, it's free. All they have to do is just reach out to me and let me know, and I'll add their name to the list.
What type of companies, if anyone's looking to hire you, what should they know?
Yeah, so what I do is I work with large organizations, with the person who is the chief diversity officer or the person in charge of global diversity for the organization. A lot of the people that I work with include Mass Mutual, Sony Pictures Entertainment. So they're well-known names, well-known, large companies. And essentially what I do is I work with their DEI leaders, in terms of providing thought leaders who come in, who I interview, who help them to gain new perspectives. So, for example, we've had CEOs that we've interviewed so that these DEI leaders can get a better understanding of how CEOs view all this and what they're looking for. And we also offer different types of programs for people that are resource group leaders. So women's resource group, veterans resource groups. And again, the idea is the more you input into these people, the more value you give them through training, development, exposure to thought leaders, the more value they bring back to their organizations. So that's what my association, it's called the CDO Power Circle, does. And I love doing it because I love sharing and I love learning, and I learn as much as I teach because I'm always encountering different people that have different perspectives and experiences through the work I do.
I am curious, like last question, how do you measure success on that?
How do you measure success in what exactly?
Just like you were talking about, like would retention of employees be a good example of like?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, there's a number of ways that you measure, success of processes like that. But one of the things that let's take the different pieces: diversity, inclusion, equity. Each piece like that, right? So diversity simply means that you're able to attract and bring people into your organization from a variety of backgrounds. That's all it means, right? And if you're effective in doing that, then you're going to get a lot of different perspectives in your organization from different people who come in who've had different walks of life. And that becomes increasingly important as we become more and more globalized, as we become more and more interconnected. Inclusion is more about how you get people to actually engage and work together effectively. Because in some cases, you're going to have people who look at the world in different ways, and maybe
bunch
they
of
come
introverts.
Yeah. And they're introverts, extroverts, and they're different, right? So how do you get these different people to work together? So that's the inclusion piece. And of course, if you think of any kind of, like in sports analogy, right? You can have a team of all-stars, but if they can't play well together, they're not going to win, right? You can have a team that's more like, of average people that will beat a team of all-stars because they're better coordinated.
Working alone doesn't communicate, small things.
Doesn't communicate, exactly. They don't work well together. And then the equity piece is along the example that I gave earlier. You want to make sure that all the people that are in your organization are properly supported to succeed. And organizations in many cases have rules and regulations that were built at a time when the population of workforce was very different than it is today. So the rules that may have worked for a man, Ward Cleaver with a stay-at-home wife and Wally and Beaver, may not work for a woman who's working in the same company today, or a man that's working in that company today. So by making adjustments to that, organizations make themselves more productive and more profitable. And I think that as the world becomes more increasingly diverse, more globally interconnected, that the differences in how effective organizations are in being able to support and engage the maximum of every person that they have is going to become increasingly important to how competitive they are versus other organizations.
Wow. Well, this was super insightful. Like I don't think a lot of people know this is like the underlined area of a lot of organizations. So I appreciate that because we're bringing light to a lot of maybe not so highlighted aspects of company culture in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe people feel secluded or not a part of it for whatever reason, and it's really not them. I think this can provide a lot of solstice for that.
I'm happy to hear that. Happy to hear it. Happy to be here today with you. Had a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Hopefully we can do this again sometime, maybe in the few months from now, just to get an update on how you see the world changing. That'd be cool.
Absolutely. Happy to do it. Let me know when you want to do it, and I'm happy to do it.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. We'll be in touch.
All right. You take care, Joe. Bye-bye.
You too.